Good afternoon. I'm going to do some speed reading because I was told I could only have 20 minutes, so bear with me. I'm often asked, with whom did you study feminist theology? And my response usually is, when I was a student, feminist theology did not exist. That is why a new field of study needed to be invented. This question does not just reveal how far we have come in the past 30 years, it also bespeaks historical forgetfulness. Such a forgetfulness can be dangerous if it assumes that the feminist struggle for women's religious authority and rights is over and won. An email I recently received from a student tells us otherwise. I am having a real hard time in school, not with work or anything, just being a feminist every day, reminding people of basic stuff, things like man is not inclusive, and having people roll their eyes or having professors refer to my critique as violent and aggressive. I come home exhausted and frustrated, and I often cry. This experience of alienation, which we have felt so often, is not past. It is fueled by both the allegedly value-neutral anti-feminist rhetoric of liberal institutions and by the strident anti-feminist rhetoric of the Christian right. For instance, in her book Ungodly Rage, Donna Steichen calls Catholic feminists, I quote, enemies of God, and likens us, for those of you who are Bible firm, and likens us to the Gadarene swine plunging off a cliff into the sea. Eventually, she says, like all religious revolutionaries, they will dash themselves to destruction against the rock of the church. End of quote. Feminist historians tell us that it is part and parcel of the power of patriarchy, or as I would prefer, kyriarchy, to vilify women's historical accomplishments, to trivialize our theoretical visions, and to co-opt our revolutionary work for kyriarchal ends, so that every other generation feels compelled to reinvent the wheel. Hence, the writing of feminist history is an act of resistance and hope. In the context of the European Society of Women Scholars in Theology and Religion, feminist scholars have initiated such a history of feminist theology project in several European countries. But to my knowledge, such an initiative has been lacking in North America until now. Although feminist theology, in my view, has its birthplace here. Thus, I'm grateful to my colleague, Professor Anne Braude, that she has initiated this project of feminist historiography by bringing us together today, not only for beginning such historical work on the basis of our own experience, but also for celebrating the anniversary of 3 originary events of feminist theological and religious women's studies: the Conference on Women Doing Theology at Cradleville, and the inauguration of the Women in Religion section at the EAR in 1972, and for commemorating the death of Elisabeth Cady Stanton in 1902. The history of feminist theology and studies in religion is often conceptualized either as one of progress, from intellectually naive beginnings to the theoretical heights of postmodern post-feminism, or it is written as one of decline. In the beginnings, there was a vibrant women's movement, whereas now feminism is being co-opted by the academy and the churches. However, such progressivist replacement tales are not only misleading and prejudicial, but also overlook that women's liberation movements have their roots in abolitionist, worker, civil rights, third, fourth world liberation post-colonial indigenous peoples and peace movements of the 19th and 20th centuries, as we heard from the preceding panel. Instead of conceptualizing the history of feminist theology and religious studies in terms of intellectual progress or displacement, I, for one, would prefer to see feminist history written as one of ongoing intellectual and social struggles of a radical, democratic, intellectually variegated and engaged feminist movement that is neither religious nor secular, a movement for change in society and religion, a movement that is speaking from a multiplicity of social religious persuasions and cultural political locations. 30 years ago, in 1971, at the annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion and Society of Biblical Literature in Atlanta, the Women's Caucus Religious Studies was called together by Carol Christ. Since I was one of only a handful of biblical scholars present at the meeting, I became with Carol co-chair of the caucus and therefore was fortunate to be a participant in this movement. Another crucial event took place in the summer of 1972 when a historic conference was organized in Graderville, Ohio, which became one of the birthplaces of feminist theology and has profoundly changed theology and churches. These two key events turned out to be decisive for the development of feminist studies in religion, not only for me personally. Since I had come to these two events with a critical feminist self-understanding, some of the discussions gave me pause because of their sometimes anti-intellectual stance and their negative evaluation of contemporary theology. In contrast to many of the participants who had been educated in neo-Orthodox Protestant theology that was critical of modernity, I had been reared in a progressive Catholic theology that was open to modernity. Since I had published a book on ministries of women in the church in 1964 and had written my doctoral dissertation on the radical democratic theological notion of the priesthood of all believers, I was aware that to undo the exclusion of women from religious leadership and theology would require a critical questioning not only of the role of women, but also of how theology and church leadership have been articulated. My previous work had anticipated several methodological issues that would later become decisive in the development of feminist and liberation theologies. The first of these issues had to do with the starting point of theological reflection. Just as most feminist liberation theologians today, I argued that doing theology must start with a systemic reflection on experience. The second methodological issue that connects my earlier work to the articulation of a critical feminist liberation theology has to do with a methodological question. Does theology begin with praxis and experience, or does it begin with dogmatic theological theories or ideologies? Depends on your view. The third issue that my earlier work raised had to do with questions about the systemic character of women's oppression. I sought to articulate a theology of church and ministry that was not interested in the clericalization of women, but in the declericalization of the church. A fourth issue that runs through both my early and later work has to do with articulating a critical understanding of gender. From the outset, and I say always to my students for various reasons, I have never been successfully socialized into femininity. From the outset, I was critical of the dominant theology of woman and its impact on women's full citizenship in institutionalized religion, but lacked a theoretical analysis. The then prevalent theology of the eternal feminine which had replaced the traditional assumption of women's inferiority and sinfulness, was buttressed by the all-pervasive cultural ideology of woman's nature and her biological essential difference from men. Although I rejected this cultural ideology of the feminine, I lacked a comprehensive theoretical framework to articulate such a different perspective. Then I have renamed this discourse of feminine difference as a discourse of the lady, or the discourse of the white lady, which determines the feminine identity not only of middle and upper class white women, but also serves as ideal for all women across the world. So I knew and partially accepted Simone de Beauvoir's existentialist analysis. I was groping for a more constructive approach to religion. What I found new and exciting at Grailville and elsewhere was to encounter for the first time a group of women who claimed the doing of theology as their birthright, who reflected on their negative experience of feminine socialization and discrimination, and then set out to change the situation. Although I had struggled to be admitted as the first woman in my university to study the full course of theology and to graduate with the equivalent of an MDiv degree, I did not and could not understand myself as a theologian who would chart a different way of doing theology and would do so explicitly in the interest of women. As a child, I could imagine that one day I would be Pope, but I could not envision that one day I would be a feminist theologian. It was the experience of a women's liberation movement that validated my own personal experience and perspective. And in so doing, it enabled me to understand myself as an intellectual, doing theology with focus on and in the interest of women as my very own people. Decisive for my future work were also a sabbatical at Union Theological Seminary in 1974, where I enthusiastically participated in the critical discussions of the New York area feminist scholars in religion meetings, which Carol again had also called together. As you can see, I'm very indebted to her. As a result of our debates, I wrote between 1972 and 76 several articles in order to clarify my own feminist theoretical approach. In the first of them, Feminist Theology as a Critical Theology of Liberation, I attempted to articulate a theoretical framework in conjunction with the critical theory of Habermas, as well as political and liberation theologies. My articles, Women's Studies and the Teaching of Religion and for a Liberated and Liberating Theology, started to deepen this theoretical exploration with a critical inquiry into the institutional practices of academic theology. While many critical analyses of church structures existed at the time, hardly any critical work had been done with regard to academic structures and institutions. In a second type of essays, for instance, in Women in the Early Christian Movement or Women in the Pauline, Pre-Pauline Churches, I took the first methodological steps toward my later book, In Memory of Her, and toward a feminist historiography. In order to move away from the study about women, I argued one must place women as historical agents into the center of attention and reconceptualize early Christian history in such a way that it becomes the history of women and men. The third type of essay opened up the hermeneutical direction in my feminist work. For instance, in my chapter on interpreting patriarchal traditions, in The Liberating Word, which was edited by Letty Russell, who is here, I argued over and against the approach of depatriarchalizing the Bible, that feminist interpretation must pay as much, if not more, attention to the patriarchal texts inscribed in Christian scriptures and must not seek to explain them away. Representative of the fourth type of work is my essays Saints Alive and Feminist Spirituality, Christian Identity, and the Catholic Vision. which reflects on my socio-religious positionality as a Christian theologian, as a Catholic theologian, and names the special group of people to whom I felt most accountable. However, by getting involved in Catholic movement politics and strategies, I was deterred from romanticizing feminist sisterhood or to see the women's movement as a liberated community. Moreover, since I had experienced religion and theology not as totally oppressive and completely alienating, but as challenging and intellectually exciting, I did not subscribe to the dualistic alternative which has permeated feminist discourse in religious studies and theology. Either totally identify with religion and theology or leave it completely behind. In such an essentializing gesture, religion and church or synagogue are understood as totally patriarchal, and feminist women are seen as liberated from patriarchal mindsets and ideologies. This dualistic feminist either-or alternative had been articulated with the biblical image of church as home and that of exodus out of patriarchal institutions. While I have appreciated the power and strategy of both images, I have not subscribed to either of them because of their essentialist either-or tendencies. Instead, I propose the radical democratic notion of ecclesia of women, that is, the Congress, Assembly, Forum, Congress, Forum, or Church of Women as an alternative organizing image, which encompasses the critical aspect and the belonging aspect of the other two images, but seeks to articulate the women's movement in religion and society, as well as feminist theology, as variegated, contentious, and conflictive, emancipatory, radical democratic movements, and organized religion as a central site of feminist debates and struggles for change. Two challenges to the dualistic conceptualization of patriarchy, which came from the women's movement in the mid-70s, stand out in memory, as having moved my thinking away from the dualistic conceptualization of patriarchy and gender oppression, and give me the courage to search for an intellectual framework that also could encompass negative experiences with women. The first challenge came at a public lecture when a woman in the audience suggested that I develop a notion of patriarchy that would include her experience as an African American woman who did not understand herself as primarily oppressed by black men, but much more so by the racism of white women and men. Her challenge made immediate sense to me because I myself had argued for quite some time that my own experience was not just determined by my gender, but also by the fact that I was a resident alien, immigrant woman speaking with a German accent. The second challenge came from a feminist journalist asking what feminist scholars had to say about the biblical subordination texts which fueled the rhetoric of the moral majority. Again, my theoretical work on the subordination text set out to respond to the need of the women's movement for clarification of these texts. I first elaborated this research into the complex structuring of patriarchy in antiquity at a conference in Hawaii in 1978 and systematized it in the early 80s, but waited until the early 90s to rename patriarchy as kyriarchy. Over the years, I have been involved not only in feminist theory, but also in practices that sought to develop new institutional ways of doing theology. And here I was less successful. During my sabbatical in New York, Judith Plasko and I began to talk on and off about founding a feminist theological journal. Finally, Judith and I pooled our financial resources and our professional contacts, and the first issue of the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion was published in 1985, the same year in which the first issue of Feminist Theology in Concilium, a Catholic journal that appears in 7 languages, emerged. Whereas the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion has adopted an interreligious, academic feminist studies approach, the feminist theology issue of Concilium offers a challenge to articulate a critical feminist liberation theology for an international audience within a progressive Catholic theological framework. However, whereas the JFSR operates financially on a shoestring in order to preserve its feminist independence, the fate of feminist theology in Concilium is controlled by an institutional structure that requires consistent struggle for the intellectual integrity of the feminist issue, a struggle that may be lost. A third kind of involvement has been my work for institutionalizing feminist theological education. After the first ordination conference in 1975, I joined Sister Helen Wright's task force on theological education that met for several years. Our discussions laid the groundwork for what would become later the Women's Theological Center. Some of us had developed an alternative satellite model of feminist theological education, which envisioned local feminist study groups that would periodically come together on a regional basis to work with a trained feminist theologian as a resource person. Rather than uproot women and bring them to a theological school or center, such a model would have sustained a feminist movement for change by creating a net of feminist study groups all across the US and the world. Because of the communication possibilities of the internet, this dream could be realized much easier today if financial and institutional backing would be found. When after almost 15 years of teaching, I moved from the University of Notre Dame to the Episcopal Divinity School here in Cambridge, I did so not just because of personal reasons, but also because EDS seemed the ideal place for establishing a resource center for feminist liberation ministry and theology. My colleague Katie Cannon suggested that we name the center the Pauli Murray Center. Unfortunately, many did not think that such a center was feasible in a small school like EDS. Hence, we developed only the proposal for an MA and Doctor of Ministry program in feminist liberation, theology, and ministry. At HDS, I have pursued this dream of institutionalizing feminist theological education in different ways. However, my dream has remained just that, a dream. Since according to the Gospels, no prophet is recognized in her own hometown, I have shifted my energies away from Harvard to Bahia. This dream includes the organization of a transnational forum of feminist scholars and educators in religion who are committed to a feminist theological vision and variegated movement. I have focused here, as we were asked, on my own experience because I wanted to contradict the growing trend telling the history of feminist theology in terms of a modernist model of progress, from non-theoretical experiential beginnings to the heights of postmodern feminist theory. In my experience, feminist scholars in religion have produced from the very beginning variegated theoretical discourses and developed fruitful new methods, strategies, and approaches. Despite backlash and some failure of vision, feminist theology and theology and studies in religion have brought about profound changes and majored into a rich and exciting intellectual field of study. I am grateful to have been a part of this historic moment, and I wouldn't want to miss it. Thank you.